Good morning, everyone. At the beginning, I would like to thank you, my friends, for the opportunity to continue our collaboration. I hereby express my gratitude to Professor Ede Szyliagi and Professor Marcin Wielec. I am delighted to be part of this unique international scientific project and to make my small contribution to it. I'm also very happy that this time we can meet within the walls of my university. Let's start. Europe although historically and culturally shaped by Greek culture, Roman law, and the Christian religion, is characterized by great diversity, constituting a de facto mosaic of nationalities, cultures, and worldviews. This is confirmed by the rivalry between the idea of nation states, also called small homelands, which lay at the heart of the integration processes within the European Union, and the idea of a common Europe state, something akin to a United States of Europe. Not everyone in favor of this idea, even more so because the federalist concept of integration necessitates the relinquishment of the sovereign powers of nation states. Hence, the concepts of a two-speed Europe or enhanced cooperation, which however lead to the segmentation of European Union, as well as alternative formats of cooperation. Such initiatives reflect a search for new, flexible forms of cooperation outside the formal framework established by EU law. The European Union was conceived as a supranational project that combines shared sovereignty with the sovereignty of member states. However, such an institutional structure requires constant negotiations, compromises, and a drive to achieve consensus among the governments of the member states, which causes delays or reduces the effectiveness of the solutions adopted in situations where swift and decisive action is required. In particularly sensitive areas, such as tax matters, foreign policy, security, or certain social policy issues, unanimity or a very broad consensus is required, which with 27 member states is difficult to achieve, to say the least. Deviating from these principles is not possible without first amending the treaties, which in turn would require the consent of all member states. At present, obtaining such consent is impossible, though this does not mean that integration processes have come to a standstill. Steps are being taken quietly towards the federalization of the European Union, as evidenced by such key areas as the judiciary, energy, climate, and financial policy, debt mutualization, and changes to family law, where EU institutions seek to remove decision-making powers from member states and decide independently. The European Union is not a monolith, but a community of sovereign, and it should be emphasized, still sovereign states, which compete very intensely for influence, building alliances, strengthening cooperation, and creating new formats of cooperation to serve the interests of the states that comprise it. The multitude of alternatives for European cooperation is a response to the very serious crises that have affected the European Union in recent years, and regrettably, the lack of an adequate response to them. One need only recall the financial, migration, health, Brexit, energy, and security crisis. Nor can we overlook the crisis of shared values, often referred to as a democratic deficit. To this must be added divergent national interests, open contestation of joint decisions, a lack of leadership capable of effectively setting the direction of development, internal EU disputes, the absence of a common strategy for countering political crises, the protracted nature of decision-making processes, budgetary constraints, and low competitiveness. A prime example of this is the security threat posed by the war in Ukraine, exactly 100 kilometers from here, which encourages some to radically increase defense spending, as in the case of Poland, the Baltic states, or even Germany, whilst for other member states such as Spain or Portugal, it does not serve as a motivator to change internal political priorities, reorient public spending, or shift the direction of European policy. It is therefore hardly surprising that member states, without regard for the European Union, acted in their own way. This was the case with decisions on the procurement of medical equipment and vaccines during the coronavirus pandemic, rearmament, sending military equipment and financial aid to Ukraine, accepting migrants, and even aid packages for their own economies, which reflected a focus on self-interests without taking into account the realities of a single market or the protection of competitiveness. All this quite effectively undermined faith in deeper integration and the strength of EU institutions. It also revealed differences in interests and perceptions of threats among European Union member states. In the face of such challenges, new formats of cooperation were more readily established, focusing on target cooperation or functional alliances. These include the Visegrad Group, and established in response to this initiative the Weimar Triangle, the Sławskowski Triangle, and the Krajowa Group, which, however, have not become respected bands recognized on the international stage. None of these initiatives has an institutional framework, legal personality, a permanent headquarter, formal governing bodies, or its own budget. Slightly greater significance is attributed to the Bucharest Line, which brings together the countries on NATO's eastern flank and aims to establish closer defense cooperation. The group meets regularly, often to prepare a common position ahead of upcoming NATO summits. However, the countries establishing these new cooperation frameworks lack the political will and, above all, the financial resources needed to undertake joint, far-reaching infrastructure investments, which would enable them to move beyond mere discussion and create a new dynamic in Central Europe. It is true that many meetings, conferences, and discussions are organized, but little comes of them. There is no doubt that for any cooperation format to have a real political impact, in addition to political will, significant financial, human, and organizational commitment is required. The European Cooperation Initiative, that currently appears to have the greatest potential, is the Free Seas Initiative, launched 2016, which brings together as many as 20 countries. Its primary aim is to eliminate the development disparities between the countries of Central Europe and those of the old Union, as well as the still visible division between Western Europe and the economically less developed Central Europe. In the area of security cooperation, there is also growing awareness of the need to develop it in the countries of Central Europe within the framework of the Free Sea Initiative. Unfortunately, however, at present, the Free Seas Initiative has not progressed beyond the level of a discussion club. All these initiatives serve to consolidate the member states and strengthen their position vis-à-vis the countries of Western Europe. They have also brought the concept and role of Central Europe in regional policy back into the public debate. Moreover, they have given this cooperation a concrete political existence. The creation of alternative cooperation formats was driven by external threats to the member states, but also by difficulties in reaching consensus among European Union member states, which confirms a lack of internal cohesion and reflects a lack of trust in EU institutions. Alternative formats of cooperation represent a pragmatic response to the inability to deepen integration in a uniform manner for all member states. It is also a sign of a decline in trust in the existing model of integration based on the appropriation of the sovereign powers of the European Union's member states. Not all countries are willing or able to integrate further, or to do so at the same pace. Some countries prefer to operate in smaller groups, which is a reaction to fears of losing sovereignty or an expression of dissatisfaction with EU policy. Alternative formats of cooperation do not question the very existence of the European Union, nor do they necessarily imply that this model of cooperation has run its course. Rather, they represent a search for new solutions and the creation of new layers of integration on top of existing structures, enabling states to cooperate in selected areas, primarily in the fields of defense and energy. The proposed cooperation formats are not clearly defined or legally formalized. They lack organizational foundations and financial backing. Consequently, they do not constitute a real competition for the European Union, which, despite all its weaknesses, remains a concrete entity with clearly defined objectives, legal personality, a common market, and many other elements uniting its member states. In short, the multitude of regional cooperation formats in Central Europe unfortunately does not translate into the quality of bilateral and multilateral relations, nor does it yield tangible results. Alternative formats of cooperation also constitute a factor motivating the European Union to pay greater attention to the needs of all member states. However, without the real commitment of countries to new cooperation formats, their establishment makes no sense. There is no doubt, however, that Central Europe, given its potential, should create an alternative cooperation format that would serve as a real counterweight to EU policy, or at least strengthen the negotiation position of its member states vis-à-vis by European Union. Even more so as it has the capacity, the experience of a shared history, and the desire to release its interests on a broader scale than so far. Thank you very much for your attention.